Welcome to From the White Pill Box, the podcast where we stomp on statism and find the white pills along the road to a stateless society. I'm your host, Mark Maresca. I'm the author of the Substack articles of the same name, From the White Pill Box, content specifically for the already red-pilled, libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists, people who've overcome the myth of statism or are close to it. It's easy for us to be black-pilled, to believe evil will win. That's where the white pill box comes in. There are real-world reasons to have hope. Let's get going. Greetings all. Thank you so much for listening today. This episode will be part 19 of my series on the myth of authority. I've linked to the start of this series, and I'd encourage you to review all the episodes if you can. Let me summarize the recent episodes in which we've discussed the progress of the transition to a free society during the next couple of decades. The running theme of the whole series, actually, is how the myth of political authority translates into statism. So long as the myth is strong, the state is strong. And if the myth is weakened, the state is weakened. So, for example, when the myth was nice and strong for most of human history, the state persisted comfortably. People who wanted to be bullies sensed the favorable environment for them due to everyone holding the myth. These bullies were all too pleased to rule, and thereby did so handily. Today we're at the very early stages of the transition in which the myth of political authority has just started to erode. And by this I am not referring strictly to a greater interest in libertarianism or anarchism, although that is happening. What's more important is that overall, taken as a whole, we are seeing an increase in skepticism of the state. So once again, this has an impact on the environment of the bullies. It's a shift in the environment compared to before. Of course, the myth remains quite strong, and the state thereby remains strong. But compared to before, we have a somewhat less hospitable environment for statism. My previous episode provided current examples of this. And most recently, we've been discussing how and why this skepticism should continue into the next decades and increase. And once again, the environment changes in turn. It gets even less favorable to the bullies. Only it will be far more tangible and noticeable compared to today. The natural question, of course, is how the bullies, the state, deal with this less hospitable environment in the coming decades. Well, though there are many imaginable ways they can deal with it, the predominant one is obvious. They'll gravitate more and more to other lines of work and steer away from being enforcers or politicians. No, not all at once and not everywhere at once. Instead, in the same ways we see it happening today, only more so. By then, both the environment and the reactions we see from the state will be noticeable enough so that libertarians and anarchists will no longer be debating it. Statism will be facing headwinds as the myth erodes, like the change in people's behavior from greater skepticism of the state, more of the outward trends we see even today, a realization that we're not going back to a society where the whole population blindly defers to the state's authority. So at that point, I'm sure we will still have statism, but it won't feel like today's statism anymore. Now, the next step in our discussions is tantalizing, asking the question, what will things be like a few decades from now in practice? How will the government be dealing with their eroding environment? What will be the status of the state's handmaidens in media and academia? Where around the world will we see changes? And of course, what happens in the decades beyond? Well, unfortunately, we have to save those speculations for an upcoming episode. The reason is because we have to do a bit of untangling of some of our own libertarian myths. You see, most of us, and I was in this group, gave in to some real superficial thinking in regards to how a transition to a free society can play out, and even timelines about the transition. I don't want those sort of poorly reasoned assumptions to be lurking in our minds as we continue this analysis. So I'll spend this episode taking on those assumptions. I'll explain them one by one, then for each, I'll show how our more nuanced analysis makes more sense. The first big libertarian assumption, that there are three players in the game: we libertarians, the majority of normies who are not libertarian, and the state. And of course the assumptions stop right there. No attempt to clearly define who the majority are. No attempt to define even what the state is. Hell, not even define what a libertarian is. Nope, just a vague us versus them mentality, meaning us libertarians against the majority who we label as blind, plus us against the state. Boy, no wonder so many libertarians are black-pilled. Maybe our own fault for starting from ill-defined premises. Well, if you've followed this series, you'd have a clearer picture. In fact, the players in the game are only two. Those same two major groups we've been discussing. One, the majority of people, including us, and two, the bullies of the state. And that's it. As I indicated before, the majority reflect in their behaviors the current strength of the myth of authority, and the bullies are forced to exist in whatever environment that serves up. So in context of the upcoming decades of the transition, look at the vast majority of people. They were, formerly, utterly enthralled by the myth of authority, and are mostly still today. But after the next several decades pass, that'll no longer be the case. Instead, overall, skepticism of the state will be tangible in the general feel of the environment created by the majority. Breaking that environment down a bit, the older people, by then, will more likely still have an emotional attachment to the state, even if they know its power is waning. A wistful respect they may still have for government, but for the middle-aged and younger, expect a large percentage to be indifferent to government, or even see it as laughable. So unlike today, the shift in the environment will be noticeable. And yet at the same time, government will still exist because it will still be tolerated, still expected. So the myth will have weakened, but will still be around, thanks to the majority. The second group is the state. And again, by the state, I mean the bullies of the state, the enforcers and the politicians. These are the people who may legally and directly dominate others. The enforcers, they are trained and armed like police and military, plus the politicians and judges and prosecutors. I call them the suits. The suits have legal authority to call out the enforcers when they please. Enforcers plus suits equal the bullies, the state. Today, there are only about 3 million bullies in the United States anyway. And that's it. That covers the relevant human players, the majority on the one hand, and the small number of bullies on the other. Now, there is an extension of the bullies, what I've called the state's handmaidens, the corporate media, academia, the big financial interests, the influential cheerleaders of state propaganda. They play into the analysis as a sort of appendage of the bullies. So we have the two groups of players, the majority and the bullies. These are the human elements. But next we have elements the libertarians have rarely factored in, which we are doing here. Those are the two factors that influence we humans: psychology and technology. Psychology is where the majority and the bullies intersect. This has been critical to the analysis throughout this series, and sadly, a component libertarians have overlooked. So let me review it again to drill it home. Statism boils down to a very straightforward psychological cause and effect. In the heads of the majority is the myth of authority. People believe they need rulers to govern them, that it is right they be subject to the moral authority of the state. Well, their beliefs are reflected in their actions, actions visible out in the world. Across an entire population, these actions create a general environment, one that basically announces the desire for rulers. It signals how favorable they are to being dominated. This attracts people who enjoy running the lives of others. I call these people the bullies of the state. And that's how we get the state. Bottom line, the myth leads to behaviors. The behaviors produce an attractive environment for bullies, and along come the bullies who are welcomed with open arms. Myth leads to the state, cause and effect. That's the psychology I'm referring to, the intersection of the majority and the bullies. But decades from now and beyond, that environment will not at all be like it was. The feel the bullies have from the environment will be a mix. It will reflect a tangibly eroding myth, though a myth that is not quite extinguished. A mix of favorability to the bullies along with a heavy dose of skepticism, indifference, disobedience, defiance. People will more and more be ignoring or laughing at them or mocking them. The difference from today, though, is that today the sense of being bully friendly far outweighs the bully unfriendly part. Not so after several decades. The welcoming aspect of the environment will have been too infected by the unwelcoming part. A bully will no longer be able to so easily consider a role as an enforcer or politician without his mind having to ponder the sense of dread that comes with the job. And then, in the even later decades of the transition, the metaphor I've used before will be way more descriptive of reality. Choosing to be a bully of the state will be choosing to stand on a cracking sheet of glass. You're there at your own peril. That's the psychological factor. The other factor in the equation is technology. Libertarians have been a bit better with this one. All of us have witnessed the universe of choices explode all our lives, but especially since the internet has matured. If we project ourselves several decades forward, we can expect those choices to expand even further. So by then, choices will more and more disfavor politics. There will simply be too many choices that are more interesting, rewarding, and fun. Political pursuits will simply have slipped down the scale of interesting things to do. This is somewhat the flip side of the psychology element. Skepticism of the state makes people look at the state as a negative, something to avoid, like a task that's unpleasant to do. Technology is the opposite of that coin. It offers better choices. It's a positive. People spend their time somewhere else where there are more pleasant things to do. So psychology and technology are two elements that really count in the transition. Finally, another assumption the libertarians have made, the overvaluing of a group I haven't even mentioned. It's the tens of millions who are the vast majority of state employees, all of those who collect a government check but are not themselves enforcers or politicians. I've called this enormous group the state clerks. Libertarians have overestimated their importance, but they do not count in this psychology. They do not hold the power to physically coerce you, like an enforcer with a gun does. And they don't have the power to call out enforcers like a politician can. So when I'm referring to the state, i.e. the state bullies, this enormous group is not part of that. Those clerks are much more like the rest of us, victims of the myth, victims of the bullies. I emphasize this because it demolishes yet another common libertarian black pill. It puts into proper and realistic perspective just how small the state truly is. Again, at least for the United States, the state, the bullies, are comprised of about 3 million people. All the dynamics, all the psychology I've talked about applies only to those 3 million bullies. How good or bad they feel in the environment of the myth of authority is all that matters. So to summarize, the two players are, 1, the majority of people whose belief in the myth is slowly eroding, and 2, the bullies of the state. And the two big factors that affect the players are, 1, the psychological environment the bullies are forced to operate in, and 2, technology. As it relentlessly advances, people have more choices. Quite simply, they have less time for politics. Okay, so now it's time to address two subjects we've gotten hung up on when we try to do these speculations: the number of people who need to be red-pilled and the timelines to a free society. As it turns out, neither are as we've assumed. We've viewed them too superficially, so let's take them on. The numbers. Generally, we think very black and white about this. We got red-pilled, meaning we realized the state is illegitimate. So we assumed the center target goal is to get others to that exact same place as quickly as possible. They need to be woken up, we say. From there, we play with the estimates of how many people need to be at that very place. So what's the reality? Well, it's not enough to assume numbers is all that matters, that we need some particular percent of people fully over the myth of authority. But the numbers is not the only relevant factor. There's a second. It's degree, the degree of being over the myth, how far they are along that road. These two elements each have importance, so let's cover them one by one. The degree of being red-pilled. This has gotten almost no attention, but it's a biggie. Here, we've made yet another embarrassingly poor assumption, that you're not relevant unless you're an anarchist. Now, believe me, I wish that anyone who's skeptical of the state were fully over the myth of authority. But the reality is that you don't need as many all the way there as you think, because there are degrees of being red-pilled. And being partly red-pilled still helps alter the bully's environment. And that's exactly what we have right now. People getting increasingly skeptical of the state, though not fully out of the fog of the myth. But now to the second factor. How many people are needed? Meaning, how many need to be skeptical of the state, show indifference, disobedience? How many does it take to alter the bully's environment? There's a reason we've been so off on these estimates. We fail to look past overblown words like the state, the government. We've used those words, then pictured vast hordes of enforcers overwhelming us like tidal waves of troops storming a beach, or endless lines of militia driving down our neighborhood streets. Scary pictures, right? So admit it, those pictures made us foolishly assume the state outnumbers us, and therefore we need enormous numbers to combat it. But the reality is so opposite. Not only do we, the majority, outnumber the state, the bully population is itself pitifully low. As I just said, in the United States, it's barely 3 million. So out of 330 million non-bullies, you wouldn't need a large percent at all to make those 3 million actually feel overwhelmed. Instead, what if the libertarians said, I've literally heard some claim that near 100% is needed, that we need to convince virtually everybody. Now, most think you need like 50%. You need to convince a majority, as if they're saying, we need enough so a majority vote in favor of freedom. All this is seriously off the mark. Go ahead. Imagine 50% are genuinely skeptical of the state. Remember, 260 million adults are in the United States. So 50% makes 130 million skeptical of the state. Somehow I think the behavior of 130 million skeptical people would manifest itself just a bit in the environment, enough to make the 3 million bullies realize they don't stand a chance. How can 3 million force 130 million to comply, outnumbered like 40 to 1? It's so ridiculous to imagine that you realize it doesn't take 50%. So obviously the percent is less. Even 20% is unnecessarily large. The 3 million bullies would be up against 50 million, outnumbered like 17 to 1. No chance. Even 10% pits 3 million against 26 million. That's 8 people for each bully. Here we are probably closer to realistic numbers. That's 26 million people changing the environment of the bullies. Of course, in fairness, we should assume many of those would be passive and wouldn't behave much differently. But even discounting them, a huge number of the 26 million would express it in their behavior, and all that would be a new environment. It would make those 3 million bullies feel seriously unwelcome. So truth is, the tipping point percent is low, way less than we've assumed. So that's our two elements, the number of skeptical people and their degree of fog clearing. The mix of those two today is showing its effects today. Virtually all of my recent examples of how the bullies even now are feeling the changing environment They're all due to the general skepticism and dissatisfaction with the state. So no, it's not top quality red pilling that's doing it, people fully over the myth. No, it's all happening with lots of skeptical people just being partly there. Again, I'd love for them to be all the way there, but I can see a white pill when it's in front of me. The growing population of skeptical people are not fully over the myth, and yet we are still seeing the bullies feeling it. I love it. So for the libertarians and anarchists who like being black-pilled, I suggest you embrace that reality. We don't have to insist that the only way to get there is for people to become full-fledged anarcho-capitalists. People are proving that wrong in real time. Instead, the combination of numbers and degree of red pilling is what creates an unfavorable environment for the bullies. It reflects the total amount of skepticism. So both count, numbers and degree. Now let me show you how this mix actually helps our outlook on the numbers. I'll use an example to explain. We're going to assume a ratio here. The ratio of we, the fully red-pilled, to all of the people in the population, all of them who merely have a healthy skepticism of the state. It's not the ratio of we, the red pill, to the blue pill. No, it's the ratio of us to the skeptical. And FYI, skeptical is actually a good description of most average people you encounter, isn't it? It's a wide ratio because there are not really many fully red-pilled, but there are a great many who have a decent skepticism of the state. I'll use the ratio 100 to 1. For every 100 who are generally skeptical, only 1 views the state as fully illegitimate. Okay? Start by imagining there are 100,000 of us in the population, 100,000 full-on red-pilled anarchists, fully over the myth of authority, and that's it. There are 0 others, no other people even slightly skeptical of the state. Literally, all people besides those 100,000 are still totally in the fog of the myth. Okay, what's the impact of this on the bully's environment? Clearly very little. Those 100,000 can be as indifferent to the state as you like. They can even be outright defiant, but they're just not enough to noticeably change the bully's environment. Change the scenario now. Picture instead 100 times that number, 10 million people. This group is merely skeptical of the state, not over the myth of authority, but having a healthy skepticism of government. They express mistrust, resentment, etc. Picture 10 million people like that in a population. 10 million people not totally in awe of the state. It seems more likely their effect on the general environment would be more noticeable than in the first scenario, just 100,000 fully over the myth anarchists, simply because there's so many more of them. And again, what do we have here in the real world? Sure, we have a decent number of fully red-pilled anarchists, but be honest, we have a hell of a lot more of those skeptical but not over the myth people. And what does that reality give us today? An environment that is getting less favorable to the bullies. And that's today. As my recent episodes have shown, that trend is likely to continue. More and more people skeptical of the state, fully red-pilled or not, and the bullies feeling even more unwelcome. Why? The increasing general skepticism. So the takeaway is this. The environment of the eroding myth of authority is a mix. A small percent of fully red-pilled and a much larger percent of regular people just starting to get over the myth. That mixture, taken in total, is enough to be shifting the environment of the bullies for the worse. So now we can once and for all see the numbers discussion for what it is. Nothing to obsess over, but providing these nice doses of white pills. 1. We need way, way less people on board than we think. Check, white pill. Why do we need less? Because there are fewer bullies, way, way less than we thought. Check, white pill. Do we want more people skeptical of the bullies? You bet. But does their degree over the myth matter in this context? No. Check, another white pill. We can take the win no matter what the degree is, because altogether It makes things rough for the bullies. Okay, now let's deal with the timelines. Here again, libertarians get this wildly wrong from not thinking it through. To start, let's most of us admit that when we first got red-pilled and super enthusiastic, we had a pretty optimistic guess about when we'd see a free society. We figured all we need to do is tell everyone. Then they'll wake up instantly. How long could it take? I'll confess that in my 20s at the start, I figured 20 to 30 years would do it. I assume a lot of you started off that naive too. Then there's the flip side, the way more common black pill projections. That happens when you lose your initial enthusiasm. Now they figure we won't see a transition to a free society for maybe 100 to 200 years. Sometimes they'll say 1,000. Okay, so let's get real. Let's again apply our insights from this very series. 20 to 30 years is indeed not enough time if you're clocking it from the very start of the transition. Why? Because the totally blue-pilled middle-aged generation plus the totally blue-pilled older generation together are highly influential, and they're the least inclined to change their thinking. So those two generations have to get too old to be influential anymore. So at minimum, you'd probably need 40 years from the very start of the transition. That's a minimum, though. Also, the timeline depends on how fast the myth erodes. For us, it's been a 50-year slog, largely because most of that time we didn't have the internet, but also because libertarian efforts did little to help. That's because they never focused on the myth as the root cause of statism. So, super slow start, and here we are at 50 years with only pitiful progress. But today it's different. We have genuine signs of the myth's erosion and the internet. So timeline speculation can now be more grounded. Our analysis in this series has taken us several decades from now. No, not to a free society, but to where it's plausible the trends will be very tangible by then. So projecting yet another few decades, which means some 40 or so years ahead, the bully's environment will feel like standing on cracking glass. When that becomes the common, known environment, it'll be rats off a sinking ship. Now, yes, I know that that image of bullies literally backing off like that in our mind's eye of today seems unthinkable. And it is unthinkable of today's environment. But it's not unthinkable for the environment some 4 decades from now. In that environment of cracking glass, anyone with a brain gets the hell off. Now, even if you've followed this series all the way through, I recognize that making a guess like that, even if an educated one, can still look overly optimistic. So let's postulate longer timelines and see where it leads us. Let's pick a full 100 years from today, the year 2125. Assume we're still not there, no free societies yet. The government is pretty much as pervasive and powerful as today. Statism hasn't changed much. Then ask yourself, what has changed over those 100 years? You can get an idea by going backwards. Ask what the world was like in 1925, 100 years ago. Most of the world was not electrified yet. Most people didn't have a phone or a car. A radio was a luxury item. Oh yeah, our world is quite different from back then. In fact, our world is radically different from 20 years ago. And that doesn't even factor in the psychology of the myth of authority. There were no signs of an eroding myth 100 years ago. Today, we have plenty of signs. So, forward 100 years? For the standard libertarian guess of at least 100, you'd need a pretty wild assumption that things stay static, that the world of technology makes little progress after today, and that the myth of authority experiences no further erosion, or maybe even backslides. Why is that their assumption? Because, as I pointed out, advancing technology is a friend of the myth eroding. It helps it along. It expands human choices. Plus, it's slowly ending the state's ability to propagandize. Put simply, advancing technology is a major reason the myth erodes over time. So when the libertarian assumes we won't see liberty progress for at least 100 years, baked into that is the assumption that technology would necessarily have to remain flat, not to mention the additional assumption that the psychology of statism also stops in its tracks or even backslides. You'd have to believe that during the coming 100 years, most of the population will be under the spell of those 3 million bullies, more or less like today. You'd have to assume little progress in the myth's erosion. Elections every 4 years as usual. Public schools, pretty much like today, with most parents still sending their kids there. Really? In the year 2050, 2070, 2100? Universities like today, spitting out indoctrinated young adults with useless, expensive degrees? You'd have to imagine some counterpart to the corporate press still acting as the mouthpiece of the bullies, successfully indoctrinating the people. Really? In the year 2050, 2070? You'd have to assume the banking system is still a handmaiden of the state, and the economy still relies on government currency, which still inflates away people's wealth, and assume that government debts haven't brought it all crashing down, that the state still hobbles along. So both psychology and technology would have to go static. All of the trends cease. When you look at it that way, sorry, but that scenario is the one that looks naive. It says technology stops, and psychology stops too. It says the state, the bullies, persist as they are today, persist in the political and financial structures they exist in today, with no long-term consequences, as if the environment they exist in along the way means nothing. Sorry, but back in the real world, people do have to deal with their environments in reality every day. We don't get to imagine things playing out, then expect reality to conform to that. Yet those assumptions do exactly that when we imagine the state, the bullies, during the next 100 years exempt from the reality of their environment, immune to the realities of economics and psychology, imagining technology stops in its tracks. That's what's unrealistic, because technology does advance. The psychological nature of people, including the bullies, does remain the same. Our analysis has tried to stay grounded in those respects. So yes, traditional libertarians, we actually can make a decent, educated guess about the timelines, a grounded best guess. A few decades from now, things should become tangible enough to be noticed broadly, that the state itself is on that shaky ground of slowly cracking glass, and that from there, perhaps a few decades more, things will get even worse for them. How will that look? Well, we'll cast our mind's eye to that stage next time. We'll put ourselves in those upcoming decades and speculate about what it could actually look like, especially for the bullies and their handmaidens, because their discomfort will manifest itself in some predictable ways. But we'll wrap it up there for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Take care and see you next time. Many thanks to Substack for hosting my podcast and my articles. And thanks especially to you for listening. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.